Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'd like to let you know that this week I'm shirking my responsibilities in giving you a repeat of an episode that I aired last year. And it's called The Future is Coming, which was true last year, and indeed it's true this year. Now, this is a storytelling episode, since talking about zucchini is not very Christmassy. But I want to update you on what's happened since I last told this story. I was accepted into a clinical trial for an experimental drug to treat my particular type of muscle wasting disease. It's a completely genetic disease called hereditary inclusion body myopathy. And apparently it's a 1 in a million situation. So I was very happy to be included into this drug study. As the first couple of months on the drug went on, I realized that my muscles were, in fact, increasing. I felt a little stronger, and to me, there was no mistaking it. But as I returned on my 3-month visit, I was told that they were canceling the study because they did not see any significant increase in muscle strength among the 30 or so patients that were enrolled in the study. So the day that I heard that, which was April 7th, 2017, when I was given the bad news that they were canceling the study, I'm afraid I didn't react too well. In fact, I started crying and said things like, "Why are you doing this to me?" Apparently taking it quite personally, which, in fact, it is to me. So I was very moody and sad for a few weeks, and didn't want to bring up the subject to many people. But alas, it is what it is. I haven't given up hope, and I hope if any of you are in situations where you feel like you have so much hope, and for some arbitrary reason your hope is dashed, that as much time as it needs to take, we all can saddle up on a high horse like that character Roy Moore from Alabama, and ride off into the sunset. Because after all, the future is coming. Enjoy the episode. Hey there, I'm Jean Tiberio, and you're listening to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 118, and it is part of my holiday storytelling episodes. I'm calling this one, The Future is Coming. Now, that was a favorite phrase of mine from my days as a registered dietitian. I would go to these conventions that the American Dietetic Association put on, and of course they'd have a keynote speaker, and the speaker would come up to the microphone and say, "We need to be proactive because the future is coming." In my opinion, the American Dietetic Association never really caught up to the future. But that's for another day. The future I'm talking about today is about the diagnosis and treatment of diseases based on identification of the damaged gene. Now, I'm not a geneticist, and I don't know this for certain, but I have read that it is indeed coming, and I believe everything I hear on the internet. Now, 2 weeks ago, I told you about the day I was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. For today's story, I'm going to tell you about how I was recently re-diagnosed with a similar neuromuscular disease. Now, I'm not saying that the doctors got it wrong. It's more that the way that doctors diagnose using our new gene technology has made the diagnosis of many diseases more sophisticated. The diagnosis that I received, muscular dystrophy, unknown type, was based on the observation that a particular person, namely me, has a muscle wasting disease. I guess many decades from now, we may look back at this and relate it to people diagnosed with fever and skin sores. That's a diagnosis, but it doesn't tell you anything about the cause. Now, I was eventually given a type of muscular dystrophy called scapuloperoneal muscular dystrophy, and I guess they were describing which muscles got weaker first before the other muscles. Then I was again diagnosed with limb girdle muscular dystrophy, This specific type of muscular dystrophy may have fit me more closely because a couple of decades went by and they had time to observe the rate of my weakening muscles. At that time, and until fairly recently, that's all doctors had to work with. There was no treatment for any of these types of muscular dystrophy. There was just a pattern of continued muscle wasting. What has kept many people like myself going is the technology related to this. For example, a CPAP or BiPAP respirator, where you get forced room air to keep your airway open. As I look back, the thing that seemed to be making my muscles disappear faster was stress, and really any type of stress. Psychological stress, physical stress, like the time I fell and hit my head, or infections, such as the flu or pneumonia. What seemed to make me feel like I had more energy was rest, and not necessarily exercise. I guess exercise would give regular folks energy, but I guess I wasn't a regular folk. But as I said in the episode 2 weeks ago, I kept doing my exercises at the Nautilus Club right after my diagnosis, and even up to the point where I was walking from machine to machine with my four-legged cane. But I was always worried that overdoing the exercise at my stage in the disease process might cause mini tears in my muscle fibers that could make the muscle cells die. They even suggest to serious weightlifters to only do the weightlifting every other day rather than every day. So I was clearly in uncharted territory, doing this type of exercise with muscular dystrophy. Now, 2 weeks ago, I intentionally told you the story of my initial diagnosis with muscular dystrophy because a dramatic change has recently taken place. And by recently, I mean only several weeks ago. I was at my neurologist's office, and she mentioned that there was a genetic saliva test for a rare type of myopathy. There was literally a 1 in 1 million chance that I would test positive. So she warned me that the chances were slim, but a saliva test is easy, so we both agreed that it was worth a shot. Well, I tested positive, and the disease I tested positive for is called hereditary inclusion body myopathy. The defective gene is the GNE gene. This gene codes for a specific protein called sialic acid. It's actually an enzyme necessary for energy metabolism in the muscle cell, and possibly other cells as well. So you can see that the difference with this specific diagnosis is that this is much more definitive, and it was made by testing my genetic makeup for a specific defective gene. All this type of diagnostic technology was made possible by the Human Genome Mapping Project that was finished about 10 years ago. So I went back and I repeatedly spit into a test tube, and my spittle was sent off to some fancy schmancy genetic lab somewhere in the country. My neurologist was grinning from ear to ear when she announced that my test was positive. She also mentioned that, to her knowledge, there were only about 30 people in the United States that have this. Well, I felt pretty special. I'm not denying it. And she was excited as she was telling me this because she knew that the NIH was doing clinical trials for this particular type of myopathy. The NIH had already gotten past years of testing on mice, and they had moved on to people. Then she checked her computer and noticed that they were taking on new patients. We call them subjects in the biological research biz. And they were looking for non-ambulatory patients who tested positive for this hereditary inclusion body myopathy. And that would be me. So, on December 20th, only 9 days ago, my aide got me up out of bed at 4 a.m., not an easy feat at all, and I embarked on my road trip to New York City to be screened for the study. Now, as I've mentioned before, I worked in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey for Lipton 35 years ago, so I was familiar with New York City, but I hadn't been back to New York since 1986. As we got closer to the city, I was super excited, and if I dare say, hyper, if that can be said for anyone described as the female version of Charles Grodin. As we got onto the FDR Parkway, we started naming songs and movies about New York. There was the taking of Pelham 123 when we saw signs for Pelham. There was the New York song from the musical On the Town with Gene Kelly. There was Simon and Garfunkel's 59th Street Bridge song, which most people refer to as the Feeling Groovy song. By the way, the word groovy will never go out of style in my book. Anyway, so we got into Manhattan and started up and down the crowded streets. We knew that the NYU Medical Center was at East 38th Street between 2nd and 3rd. As I said in my podcast 2 weeks ago, I love numbers, so I was in charge of counting the streets. The first thing that hit me after being away for 30 years is the sound that New York City makes. There's the constant honking of horns, occasional police whistles, and so on. And then, of course, there's the sights of New York City. The old storefronts with dirty windows that you know have been there for at least 30 years. A laundromat would have the name Laundry on a dirty sign in the window. When we had a break, we went to a pub called Kendrick's that was only a block from the NYU Medical Center. I insisted on wheeling into the table at a spot where I could look out the all-glass window. At one point, I saw an old man hunched over, walking with a cane, slowly walking by 3 lanes of stopped traffic. The red light was in his favor, but I wondered, for how long? I mentioned to my sister that maybe there's a 50-50 chance this poor fellow would get across the street without being hit by a taxi, or at least being gently nudged by the taxi. The point being that in New York, he simply needs to walk faster if he's to get across a New York City street. That's the New York City way of thinking about things. So I finished with my appointment at 4 p.m., and as predicted, we ran into rush hour traffic in New York City. By the way, nothing compares to rush hour traffic getting out of New York City. That's the bad news, that it took us 1.5 hours to get out of the city. The good news is I got a tour of many famous New York sites that I had missed. One of my favorite places to go was the Natural History Museum, which we passed. Another favorite place was Central Park, which we literally drove through at 3 miles per hour, a good walking pace. We drove down Madison Ave, we drove down Fifth Ave, we viewed the George Washington Bridge with all of its lights and its general magnificence, if you like bridges, that is. We drove by the coffee place that was made famous by the TV show Seinfeld, and on we drove. I've been told that one of the most famous things said about New York City is that you either love it or you hate it. Perhaps you can love it for one day and then leave it, which is what we did. I was exhausted by the time we got home, which was about 11 p.m. But it was worth it because now I can realistically hope that I can stay in this wonderful, albeit less than perfect world for as long as humanly possible. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.